This is another iRaw podcast.
Hello, I'm Amelia Leese, and welcome to Season 4 of Think Like a Vegan, a companion podcast to my book entitled Think Like a Vegan, which is also available in paperback and audiobook. You've heard this before. We have a problem with this or that animal. And we hear it all the time. For example, in the UK, and I'm making air quotes around this, the problem animals are deer, badgers, and even foxes. Elsewhere, it might be dogs, goats, mice, rats, cats, bunnies, hedgehogs, elephants, wild boar, beavers, wolves, coyotes, bears, or red or gray squirrels, monkeys, alligators, snakes, or crocodiles. Seriously, this list is of animals I've personally heard referred to as problems in a variety of places. And everywhere, pigeons are a problem. In seaside locations, watch out, it's those pesky seagulls. Of course, we then get to insects like cockroaches and flies. We've got to ask ourselves, who isn't a so-called problem? And what happens when we make other animals into problems? My guest today is Claudia Hirtenfelder, who is the host of one of my favorite podcasts, The Animal Turn. And you should absolutely go subscribe to that and listen to the back catalog. I've learned a ton from it over the years. Claudia holds a PhD in geography and degrees in gender studies, political science, and journalism. And today she'll talk to us about an article she wrote for EPE Nature and Space, where she identifies the process of making animals into problems. Well, welcome, Claudia. I am so happy you're here because I listen to your podcast, The Animal Turn, all the time. It's my constant companion whilst I'm running. And I'm pretty sure I have poached, maybe that's not the right word, but I have gotten some guest ideas from you, as well as some, a variety of inspiration from your podcast. So I love your work. So I'm thrilled you're here.
Thank you so much. That's super kind. It's great to be on your show. I've also been listening to you while running. So look at us being running. Right, it's like we're running together. Running is a new thing for me. I've started it this year. I started a couch to 10K.
Oh, well done.
Recently achieved, right? Thank you. I recently achieved the 10K. So I'm like, wow. So now I don't have to do anything more for the rest of the year, right?
So you're done.
Exactly. No, but it's been great listening to your show. And I've got to say, the episode where you spoke about the differentiation between animal rights and animal welfare. Yeah. If you listen to The Animal Turn, you know that I'm often like, it's complicated and confusing and what exactly are rights? And then I listened to yours and I was like, okay, she's got it. Yeah. So that was really just such a clear, wonderful episode. I think like something that should just be given to students that are studying rights and welfare at universities or in school. Really, really wonderful. Same thing with your episode on like biosecurity and speaking about animals and disease. So really great work.
Well, thank you.
I'm happy
you had a fantastic series on biosecurity as well. And that was tremendous. I'm going to have to ask you how you come up with but maybe we'll do that. We'll do that afterwards. We'll get into it and chat more. Before we hear from Claudia, I want to read a brief excerpt from her paper. Claudia writes, I define the problematization of animals as a social, spatial, and historical process in which animals come to be discursively constituted as problems in urban regulation and materially managed as such. I originally developed this framework to understand the historical problematization of cows in Kingston, Ontario, but it can be applied to understanding the urban history of other animals, possibly even exploring the problematization of animals today. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you again for having me on the show to talk about this paper. I often have opportunities, I think, to talk about the podcast, but not so often to talk about some of my own research. So this is really great. I spent a lot of time developing this paper on thinking about problematization, and I'm happy that it's out and it exists out there in the universe somehow. But in essence, this paper offers a framework that can be used to analyze how animals are problematized. So when I talk about an animal as a problem, or when someone talks about an animal as a problem, I challenge that a little bit. I don't view animals as inherently problematic. Rather, I'm interested in how they come to be understood and governed as problems and what this means for how they can experience the world. I originally developed this framework to understand the historical problematization of cows in a medium-sized Canadian city, Kingston, Ontario, which is also where I was living while doing my PhD. And while I've developed the framework for understanding urban historical animals, it is arguably also useful for thinking about animals today and those who live outside of cities, which I know you've got an interest in some animals outside of cities that have been subject to some problematization.
Absolutely.
Nonetheless,
yeah, definitely.
Nonetheless, the focus on history did push me to think more analytically about quote unquote problematic animals and the ways in which we can assess and understand their lives. It allowed me to see the category of problem as a process, because I saw how some animals moved from being relatively accepted or benign to becoming visible in cities as problems. So it was clear to me that some animals go from just being kind of not thought about, completely invisible, accepted, and something happens and sparks their kind of problematization. So it's a process, it's not a thing. So this kind of analytical sensitivity is important because once an animal has been labeled a problem, they tend to be constantly regurgitated and objectified as a problem. It happens again and again, and it ends up becoming difficult to view them as anything other than a problem. The analytical neglect of animals as subjects is illustrative of epistemic invisibilities in urban theory and an acceptance of violence directed at animals. So I think in general, the reason that animals are treated as objects in urban analysis and thought is because people either just don't think about animals as being significant or important, or the kind of violence that acts of problematization involve are just accepted. And the taken for grantedness of some animals' status as problems, I argue, often fails to recognize that problematization involves multi-species power relations that animals experience. So when you are labeled as a problem, it's not just neutral, it's something that animals actually experience. And I think our job as researchers is to, one, understand problematization as a process, but two, to really take seriously what it means for animals who experience this process. So think here, for example, about the numerous extermination campaigns that have been leveled against rats, pigeons, and dogs in many parts of the world. Once these animals are labeled as problems, the ways in which they're allowed to move through cities changes. Their status as problems opens and forecloses opportunities for them to act. And here, a kind of easy example to explain this is to maybe think about a child in a school who's labeled for whatever reason as the problem child. So the second a child kind of gets labeled as a problem, whether it's for learning difficulties or behavioral challenges, a whole bunch of activities start to be mobilized. Certain actions that they want to do, they can no longer do. They have to go to detention because they're behaving in X way that's viewed as a problem. And that limits their opportunities to act. They can't go hang out with friends after school. They have to go to detention. It also potentially opens up different unforeseen opportunities to act for them. So it's not necessarily inherently negative, but this act of making someone or labeling someone as a problem does have an impact on the ways in which they move through the world. So animals' status as problems opens and forecloses opportunities for them to act. The current slaughtering of thousands of dogs or hundreds of dogs in Istanbul and Turkey is an example of this kind of problematization in practice. Istanbul has long been lauded as a place in which strays were accepted, even celebrated as part of the city's identity, but more recently they have been subjected to brutal campaigns to eradicate and remove them. And this is really, really political at the moment. So asking about problematization of animals is a political question. It's a question about who belongs in cities and who has the right to the city. It is also a multi-species question because animals who disrupt urban imaginaries find themselves in various states of exile, with any existing acceptance precarious at best. The extent to which problematized animals are removed from or made invisible in cities could be considered indicators of a, quote, successful governance response to such problematizations. So what I mean by that, successful from the viewpoint of the city wants to get rid of these animals, and if the animals are viewed as invisible or they're removed from the city city governance would view this as successful. So, for example, you could think about pigeons and pigs have both historically been problematized in New York City and have been subjected to eviction campaigns there, but these have had various levels of regulatory success. Unlike pigs, pigeons are comparatively more epistemically and physically visible in the city today. So people don't imagine kind of pigs walking through New York, but pigeons are very much still visible, even though both have undergone different problematization. And the reason I think that these differences exist is one, because eradication campaigns have a proven track record of being unsuccessful. So the removal of pigs from New York was not, however, an eradication campaign. In effect, how these animals were removed, pigeons and pigs, or attempts at removing them, were not the same. There was attempts to eradicate pigeons, so to just wipe them out and kill them, and those kinds of campaigns rarely, if ever, work. But pigs and the removal from New York was not defined by an idea of eradication, but rather this idea of distancing. They didn't want to kill pigs, they just wanted pigs to be further away. And this is because the removal of pigs was shaped more by the intensification of pig farming and the problematization of unwanted waste that came from this production than from the pigs themselves. They were also problematized because the pigs were associated with a specific human population in New York, namely immigrants. So problematization is not then a static one-size-fits-all process. And in order to understand how animals become problems requires analytical attention. It requires one to do detailed, in-depth analysis that is context-specific. So just to kind of give you a neat, short definition of problematization, it's a socio-spatial and historical process in which animals come to be discursively constituted as problems in urban regulation and materially managed as such through disciplinary practices that frequently rely on material and spatial interventions. Now, things have been pretty high in the sky right now, and I hope you're still with me. But let me walk through some of the kind of logics that can be used to problematize animals. And in my reading of literature, I identified, and in my own work, identified at least 3 logics that are used to problematize urban animals. 1, they flout human urban imaginaries. 2, they're entangled with and possibly disrupt human economic objectives. And 3, they're affiliated with other problematized populations or situations. So animals who disturb ideas of the city being a modern or human place, who disrupt economic operations, or who are associated with problematic situations like disease outbreaks might be problematized. So examples here include rats who live off city waste, monkeys who encroach on urban developments, and feral cats who disrupt domestic wild boundaries.
We'll pause for a soundscape interlude, after which we'll return with more from Claudia Hirtenfelder. This is No Time by Matthew Gerstenberger.
Have you done much switch lately?
No time. I haven't done anything lately because we're just moving. Moving house. Moving house, so no time to do anything. Just finish work, go home, clean up, relax, and visit. So visit.
How is your new house?
Not bad. Really sunny. Facing.
We're back for the second part of Claudia Hirtenfelder's discussion about the problematization of animals.
So this idea of the modern civil imaginary is quite prevalent in North American and European cities, and it's often framed and undergirded by the idea of cities sitting in opposition to nature. Somehow cities are not natural, and this is starting to undergo some changes, I think, at the moment. But the kind of historical problematization of animals had to do with this kind of bifurcation of cities being human and nature being outside of cities and wild. And this is not to say that cities are devoid of nature, but that only controlled, dominated, and domestic nature is expected and accepted. So here I'm thinking about things like manicured lawns, monkeys in zoos, cats in homes, and fish on plates. In the 19th century, and arguably still today, animals who disrupted the anthropocentric imaginings of the ordered city were subjected to problematization. While this imaginary of nature being external to cities is characteristic of European and American imaginaries, it is often exported and adopted in other cities seeking to be quote-unquote smart or modern. And this is the case with Istanbul as well. So another way in which animals are problematized is if they're entangled with human economic objectives. And I spoke a little bit to this with talking about the pigs a moment ago. Economic systems are shaped in and through power relations and are a key site for where animals are constituted and regulated as objects. One particularly enduring and often not problematized way in which animals are objectified is as commodities. Within urban economic relations, animals might be valued and constituted as inputs, they might be undervalued as excess, or they might even be regarded as threats. And I owe a great deal to the work of Collard and Dempsey in terms of this language. They've done a lot of work on thinking about animals and capitalism. So, for example, you could think urban squirrels that chew through power cables and are responsible for a loss of electricity, they may be thought of as threats to financial urban markets that are trying to operate, right? But this is very different from animals who are actively included in economic relations, like the pigs I mentioned earlier. In the 19th century, butchers and the animals they killed were increasingly pushed to the fringes of cities like San Francisco. As they grew, these industries grew, more space was needed to process these animals. From Chicago to Toronto and San Francisco, the problematization of domesticated farm animals, such as cows and pigs in the city, was shaped by their entanglement with growing meat markets. There are then, again, varied ways in which animals can be problematized. So animals can be problematized because they disrupt imaginaries, because they're entangled in economic systems. But third, they can also be problematized because they are affiliated with a particularly problematic population or situation. Now, this could be with another animal or human group, or it could be with a particularly challenging situation, place, or substance. A classic example here are of rats who were problematized because of their symbiotic relationship with fleas, who were again associated with a particularly severe disease situation, namely the plague. If you're interested in the plague, definitely check out Christos Linteris' work. He's done remarkable work there. Another entanglement here is of flies and livestock animals in Toronto, where the presence of flies was used to trouble the belonging of farm animals like pigs and cows. Flies here are actually really interesting. People might not know that historically flies were thought of playthings as like toys. Children used to play with flies. It was flies only kind of became seen as problems when ideas of germ theory emerged, and flies were affiliated and associated with germs. They were literally used as a metaphor to explain germ theory. So I think that's really interesting. Now, animals' affiliations with some human groups is often cross-cut with ideas about class, race, and gender, and it frequently involves tactics of dehumanization and animalization. For example, the urban regulation of salmon and chickens in Seattle was used as a proxy for managing Japanese and Chinese immigrants in the city. So recognizing this kind of species privileging and hierarchizing both within and between different groups can afford us an opportunity to really analyze how broader power structures of control and domination are sustained. Now, it's important to note here that while species is often used as a shorthand for discussing and explaining animal populations generally, and problematic populations in particular, species is not necessarily the underlying logic that defines animals as problems. Sometimes only a subset of species, such as stray dogs, or mixed populations like strays in general, are problematized. Therefore, species is just one marker for how a population could become known as a problem or become a problematized object. And being sensitive to this means that one can take seriously how one species or one group of animals might be subjected to varied practices of problematization, which position them in several grids of urban intelligibility. So in the history of Kingston, Ontario, cows tended to flout existing and future-oriented imaginaries of the city as ordered, propertied, and sanitized. It was really interesting kind of property relationship there. Cows were objectified for their utility in making milk and meat, but they were also affiliated with disease and waste associated with that production. So while not mutually exclusive, what at first appeared to be dispersed framings of cows ended up framing them as transgressive, risky, and waste, and eventually prompted their physical, socio-spatial, and imaginative removal from Kingston. And this is what actually got me interested in this in the first place. I was kind of surprised to learn that cows were ever in Kingston. They've kind of been scrubbed completely from the history of the city. And I was surprised to learn that, in fact, when Kingston was first incorporated as a town, there were more cows in the city than horses. So horses have this really firm place in urban imaginaries, whereas cows do not. So what explains this kind of scrubbing from the urban imaginary? So I think I've been talking for a while. Without going into too much detail with regards to the analytical framework in particular, I just want to say that it's comprised of two main arms. The first arm grapples with how problematization objectifies animals and how this objectification shapes the ways in which they can be urban subjects. And I understand a subject here is a being who is conscious and who socially experiences, perceives, and responds to their world, whereas an object is a thing that is acted upon. And as I've already said, there are many ways in which animals are objectified as food, as commodities, as ecosystem services, as infrastructure, and, as I argue, problems. And I argue that it's important to pay attention to this objectification because it has constitutive power, which, as I've already said, shapes the ways in which animals can act or not in cities. The second arm of the framework, which takes up most of the paper, is focused on what I call spatial technologies that are used to govern animals. And I borrow here from Chris Philo and his work and reading of Foucault's Spatializations and Birth of the Clinic. And he looks at three kind of overarching spaces, and I adapt them to thinking about urban animals. And that's spaces of configuration. So these are documents or prescriptive texts in which animals are defined as problems, things like policies, laws, diagrams, in which they are objectified. The second are material spaces of governance. These are the spaces in which animals' bodies and environments are actively governed. And I'm talking here about the material act of governing. And here I borrow quite a bit from Claire Palmer and her use of constitutive externalized and internalized practices. And we can talk a bit more about those if you like to following this. And finally, in the last one, I talk about social or institutional space. So you can talk about how animals are discursively defined. You can even focus on the ways in which they're physically managed, so how their space is physically managed and their bodies are physically managed. But you have to also focus on the social and institutional space in which these problematizations are happening. And the reasons for this are complex. One of them being that the institutions that come to define animals as problems again, tend to reify them as problems. So there's a reason why pigs often come up when talking about waste, cows often come up with talking about slaughter, is because the institutions that were governing these practices, so Board of Works or the market, they not only problematized these animals, but constituted these animals in the historical record as problems. And scholars frequently fail to disrupt this, that animals were problems in this space, but there were many other things and practices and relationships that these animals were having, and those are analytically neglected. So I've got a whole bunch more, but I think I'm going to leave it there. In essence, my hope is that this framework and mobilizing frameworks like this will help to make animals and their experiences of urbanization and practices like problematization more visible. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was so interesting. I found your entire paper very interesting. I mean, some of it is certainly challenging, and but it's really interesting because it also challenged some things that I had never thought of. You talk about in your paper at one point how the animals themselves internalize some of the way we have made them into problems. Like, and in particular for me, you talk about how cats, even though some may be allowed to go outside, they then don't go outside because we keep them inside. And I had cats and I kept them inside because I live in an urban environment. But then when I'm in a non-urban environment, I would let them out. Supervised, always supervised. But so Marmee would go out and run around, and Sandy, his brother, he didn't. He did a little bit, but he was, in the way I always put it, he's too civilized. He's not interested. But maybe he wasn't not interested. Maybe he internalized this regime, and he said, okay, well, this is where I hang out. Whereas his brother broke through that and started exploring, and so thank you for stating that, because it made me realize things that had never occurred to me. That even though, and as you said, some of these problems may not be necessarily inherently bad. Like, I was looking after them. I didn't want them to get hurt in the urban environment. And so I really had no choice but do that. But yet that has a price, or a potential price, and a price I will never know whether that was something that he liked or didn't like.
Yeah, it's, so when internalized practices are probably the most challenging to try to think about. So in terms of your two cats, we could say, well, to what extent is this a product of training and of circumstance versus of personality? Maybe one of those two cats is just more gregarious than the other and more likely to explore and go further. But the point here with internalized, kind of constitutive and internalized practices is to say that we do things to animals that they do tend to comply with and resist. I'm not to deny resistance here, but they do tend to comply with. So a dog, for example, who walks loose on a leash has internalized to some extent their training. Whether they're questioning that training or not, that's a next level, and that may be beyond the scope of this paper. But it's more a matter of saying there are ways in which animals have kind of internalized different urban practices. Another good example is perhaps thinking about crows in Japan. There's some dated footage from BBC that recorded crows who remarkably figured out a way to drop nuts off the top of traffic lights, so that cars would drive over them and crush the nuts, and they would wait for the traffic lights to turn red. So they would literally stand on the side of the road. They wouldn't go into traffic, wait for the lights to turn red, and then they would cross the intersection to eat their nuts. Now, this is obviously observant, but they've also, to some extent, internalized the ways in which traffic work. They understand. They show a kind of grappling with it. Now, that's them watching. Whereas with cats being kept inside or dogs being walked on leashes, there is regulation for this, right? You can't just walk with your dog off leash anywhere you want. There are specific spaces. So here in Vienna, there are off leash dog areas, and you can walk with your dog off leash there. But if you're walking anywhere else with your dog, they should be on leash. And if their leash comes off, then they should have a muzzle on. So there is clear urban regulation with regards to how dogs can and cannot move through the city. And perhaps the extent to which these dogs fight wearing a muzzle or accept it is illustrative of this kind of like internalized acceptance. Maybe that's too soft of this. I think Claire Palmer's work with this is really interesting, and it was very useful for thinking through these relations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you said, it's all part of power relations, and it's different ways that we exhibit the power that we have, and how we're going to wield it, and against whom, and for the benefit of whom, and all of that. So, I think it's really interesting, and I think it's really good to think about these things, and I hope that people will read the full paper. And I think that there's a great table right at the start of your paper that you set it all out in a way, all the various categories and the sorts of things you can think about. And I think it's great. And I think also, and see if you want to know if you agree, it's a great way also to use for advocacy in terms of changing the perspectives of people when they're talking about quote unquote, problem animals. I think you can use that to frame your own thinking and your own advocacy in terms of how you approach the questions with people.
Well, I hadn't thought of that, to be wholly honest. I guess I'm just driven and interested in this idea of how animals become problems, and I think it's something a lot of scholars have focused on. Like, why are some animals problems and others are not? And there are several urban geographers who have looked at urban animals as problems, but in terms of thinking about advocacy, perhaps this is something someone else can run with and see, because there are, the other side of this, which is also what I'm hopefully going to start working on now is thinking about solutions, right? So advocates often tend to focus on animals as solutions. And does this also do some sort of objectification work? And again, it's not a matter of saying whether this is right or wrong. I think any time an animal is just completely understood as an object is probably verging on problematic. We should be thinking about how they experience becoming labeled as a problem, but also as a solution. So a lot of advocates and a lot of folks today are often talking about like nature-based solutions or ecosystem services. And I know you've spoken before about how we tend to constantly capitalize on things, how we use economic logics to frame our interventions. And here I think, well, what happens when we start to frame animals as an ecosystem service, right?
Yes.
What's lost in that kind of move? So, I mean, maybe this has some purchase for advocates. That would be lovely.
I definitely think so, because in some ways people do it. I mean, in some ways, I've sort of done that to some extent when in my work, when I'm in the rewilding project that I'm involved with, and people talk about deer and how deer is such a problem, deer are a problem, deer are a problem, deer are a problem. And I have a problem with that because the deer are not a problem. The deer are the deer living their lives on this landscape. Some of the deer, they were introduced into the landscape many years ago, hundreds of years ago, some of them. But yet they're the problem. No, they're not a problem. They're here, and they have a right to their own life and to exist. But we sort of mete out the biggest penalty on them by killing them because they are a problem, because they're eating the grass, and not the grass, they eat the shoots of trees and so forth, which makes growing trees a bit more difficult, and so on and so forth. But even that is not their problem. We are the one, we globally, meaning we people, cut all the trees down. And if you can move people, and if you can find ways to analogize and have stories around that, have a narrative around that, where you're talking about the animals in the context of the history itself of the place where you are. And just like how you've done, talking about the cows in Kingston and so forth, I think it does change people's perspective, because when I do talk about things like this, it does stop people, because they've never thought of it that way. They've only thought of it. And as you said, once you stick the problem label on, that's it. It just sticks for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think several things are interesting about what you just said. So, excuse me. On the one hand, I think it's analytically interesting, right? So why did deer become labeled as problems, and why has this exploded right now? Why has it gained so much visibility now as a problem that needs to be acted upon? And I think when you start to ask those questions, you start to unpack the politics of this a lot more, right? You start to think a lot more about what economies, what politics, what interests are at play in labeling these animals as problems. And again, in my pushing back against problematization, that's not to say that these are not problematic situations, right? That things maybe need to be done, that there are not other populations and species that are being impacted. But the taken for grantedness of that labeling should be challenged. And the ease with which things like eradication campaigns or culling are employed should be taken note of, because this is, again, things that sentient, conscious beings experience. They experience their environments being cut off. They experience themselves being separated from their herds, their loved ones. And I think we need to really take seriously that they experience being labeled as problems and these kinds of material interventions into their lives. So on the one hand, I think it's analytically interesting, and it's politically important to focus on why specific animals in specific places are becoming problems now, right? Or at a particular moment in time. So I would love to kind of see you work on that and unpack a little bit more, maybe apply the framework and see if it works for you. But another part of this question is also methodological. because they've been constantly regurgitated and reiterated as problems, it becomes so difficult. Like, how do you write this differently? How do you, as a scholar or as an advocate, how do you literally create a different story or a different narrative? And that was another part of my dissertation, which is where this work is from. And another paper has been published talking about this, where we have to actually learn to write differently. And I attempted to weave throughout my work kind of these vignettes and stories of the animals themselves, but not in a way that was fanciful or I was just kind of making up stuff. It was informed by the archive and was informed by contemporary knowledge on how these animals psychologically and physically will respond to particular situations. So in the case of deer, you hear a gunshot, what kind of physiological and social reactions could you expect for those deer to have in that situation? When their environments are cut, what kind of social and physical interactions of the deer might you expect? And I think when we start to position the animals themselves as the subjects, really interesting things start to happen instead of always putting kind of humans' interests at the forefront.
Exactly. You're shifting the attention to the non-human animal versus always our interests and our own agendas, which I absolutely, I'm 100% on board with all the time whenever I have to think about these issues. I want to shift a little bit. I want to talk about The Animal Turn, which is one of my favorite podcasts. And so every season, this is what I think about. Every time you have a new season, I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going to be the theme now? And how do you, unlike me, which I am not doing themes, but I've never been very good at themes, even with like themed parties, I'm not good at things like that. So how do you come up with the themes? Is it something that you think about a long time before? Do they sort of organically come out of other conversations? What's your inspiration for the themes?
So I mean, I think thematically, I like to just kind of think across ideas. And I think each of the seasons tends to have a bit of an arc where I try to lay foundational concepts, and then I often have good examples. And this is also part of, I think, a pedagogical way of thinking. Like if you clump everything together, maybe the season on biosecurity will be useful for a lecturer who's working on biosecurity to help their students. But for inspiration, it's partly driven by my own interests, but also by kind of being opportunistic and listening to people around me. So the season on sound, which, there's been quite a few like focused on medicine and biosecurity and politics and law. You can really see those as quite related. Of course, there's one on urban animals, which is my kind of key interest and go-to. But the one on sound might be like, whoa, what's going on here? That's a bit out there. And it was awesome. And it was partly inspired by, while I was doing my PhD, I was part of a lab of people that were all looking at nature sounds. And I was doing a side project on nature sounds. And I never really applied myself to thinking about sound. I'd started doing the podcast, and all of a sudden I was very aware of sound and how like fans and windows impact the quality of sound. And then a good friend of mine was doing her PhD on kind of like how historical bird recordings are used to find animals or talk about extinct birds. And all of this, I was just like, whoa, okay, sound is really fascinating. And those conversations just blew my mind. It was just such a fun set of talks where you just step outside of your own comfort zone and you find yourself just really stimulated. In the next coming season, I spoke to a whole bunch of gamers, and I know nothing about gaming. Nothing. I mean, I literally do not even know what like the devices that you use to play games with are called, right? Consoles, yes.
Yeah. Or something.
Something along those lines. And it was just the most fascinating conversations. I think I'm just really stoked. I love getting deep with topics I enjoy and I'm comfortable with, but I also am really stimulated by just stepping outside of my comfort zone. And I'm pretty opportunistic. I think that's part of it. I come into contact with someone, I'm like, ooh, you want to work together on creating a show?
No, I think it's great because it does show, and there's such a variety of guests and topics. I think it's fantastic, and so I can see that, and I'm excited about this new season. That sounds great because I too know nothing about gaming at all.
The whole season isn't on gaming.
I understand.
Is on animals and media, but one episode will be about gaming. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's great. And the sound one is fab. So on that note, I'm going to ask you, where can people follow your work? And do you have any projects you'd like to promote?
Yeah, great. So the Animal Turn you can find on the animalturnpodcast.com. The Animal Highlights, which is a spin-off podcast of the Animal Turn, is also there. And you can find out more details about both podcasts on that website. I have not yet gotten fancy enough to develop my own location. So if you want to get in touch with me, do it via the podcast or through LinkedIn. I'm there as well as Claudia Hirtenfelder. In terms of projects, so I'm continuing with the Animal Turn. I'm developing the season on animals and media, and I've got a couple of other seasons that are in production at the moment, but I'm going to be mum on those until I've got a little more under wraps.
Fair enough.
And yes, I've been working with a couple of different people on generating some animal highlights that are pretty exciting. And one of them is looking at animals in Atlanta, which is going to be very cool. And that'll come out later in 2025. And as myself, Claudia, the scholar, I'm developing some of this problematization stuff, like I said, to now focus more on thinking about how animals are framed as solutions in kind of sustainable and green cities, and what this means for animals in terms of how we imagine future cities. So when we talk about sustainability, we've always got in our mind a kind of future imaginary. And what is this future city that we're talking about, and how are animals positioned there? And I think they're deeply neglected, in fact, in this vision of the future city. And I think unless we position animals in our politics and our policies and our thinking about this future city, we're going to just end up with more conflicts and more situations in which animals are problematized and hurt. So that's kind of where I'm hoping to focus my scholarly attention. And then, I've also been doing some work with Transformation Austria and the Phoenix Zones Initiative. And these things are all slowly just coming together.
What are those? Tell me about that.
So Transformation Austria is an NGO here in Austria, and they do, they're focused on kind of education about how farms can become plant-based farms. So perhaps how farms that are focused on animal agriculture can transition to plant-based agriculture, or how one can focus on an established plant-based agriculture at the onset. It's a relatively new NGO, and there are transformation groups that do a lot in the way of consulting, so going out and consulting with farms. This branch is primarily focused on education and creating tools for thinking through that kind of agriculture. It's new for me. I'm learning a lot in these interactions. The Phoenix Zones Initiative is with Hope Fedosian, who I did have on the Animal Turn.
That's right. Yes, it did ring a bell, and yes, exactly.
And she's done remarkable work. So they're busy creating an institute that's focused on justice with regards to both human and animal rights. And they're doing a lot of work on how can we start to think about health and politics and humans and animals in the same frame. And again, they're busy developing different systems for thinking through this. And I'm kind of in the background helping with some of those conversations. And then the final plug is the Vienna Animal Studies group, which myself and a group of friends who are interested in animals have just launched. It's got its own website now. And we're excited to try to stop mobilizing scholars, because Vienna's been oddly behind with animal studies. So now we're we're going to do it. And it's very exciting.
This all sounds exciting. I'm
really
sorry.
I just listed off a laundry list of things. I'm going through my to-do list with you. I'm sorry.
No, I love that. I completely love that. I'm going to put the links to everything in the show notes, so everything will be there, so people can look it up and find you. Once again, thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving me your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show, for your work with the book. Congratulations on the next edition coming out.
Thank you.
And I'm looking forward to this upcoming set of episodes from you. So thank you. Thank you for including me. I very much appreciate it.
At this point in the podcast, I usually add some related context, and I'll do that in a moment. First, I want to highlight a brilliant film essay which came out after Claudia and I recorded this show, and which features Claudia's research. The film is about reframing our perspective on urban animals. It's called Straying Home, and it follows a number of street-living animals in a city in Romania. It's beautiful, contemplative, and very thought-provoking. I highly recommend it because weaving philosophy, film, and beautiful imagery is a tremendous skill. It was made by Just Wondering, a small autonomous collective creating critical and speculative animated essays exploring a variety of topics such as anti-speciesism, post-humanism, and social and environmental justice. The collective consists of Aaron Noor, independent researcher and self-taught filmmaker artivist, Mina Mimosa, visual artist and illustrator, and M. Martelli, writer and researcher activist. All their work is superb, and I'll include the link to the film and their website in the show notes. Second, and talking about street-living dogs, Claudia and I didn't get a chance to talk about the relatively new legislation affecting dogs in Turkey. I wrote about that some time ago if you want to know more. It's a situation which illustrates the political nature of making animals into problems, just as Claudia describes it. As usual, the link will be in the show notes. And finally, some context. You heard me earlier in the show mention deer. In the UK, it's always deer who are blamed for the nation's ecological devastation and lack of forests. They're identified as the problem. No one else. But here's the thing. According to British shooting magazines, Countryfile, and even the UK Parliament, there are 2 million deer in Britain. But do you know how many sheep there are in the UK? As of June 2024, there were 31 million sheep in Britain, and they graze on the same hills, mountains, valleys, and forests where the deer are living. But we can't talk about the sheep, because as soon as you do, the animal agriculture lobby goes into meltdown. So yeah, making animals into problems is always political, and it's always about us.
We tear things up when we go round. We burn things up when we go round. We speed things up when we go round.
That's it from me, Emmy Leese. Thank you for listening. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com if you have questions, comments, or want to suggest a guest or a topic for discussion. I'd be happy to hear from you. And you can find more of my work and upcoming events on my website, emilialeese.com, and on Substack and on social media. And buy a copy of Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks, or request it from your library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashbacks, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.